Welcome once again to the Heart of a Shepherd. We're continuing to work toward catching up on our study in the book of Deuteronomy. I've traveled several days this past week, and I hope that some of you will be able to take advantage of these video devotionals. Well, the title of our study today, The Principle of Corporate Identity and Conditional Promises. Deuteronomy chapter 5. I invite you to open your Bible there. Now, Moses' first oration to Israel concluded in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 43. Then, following a brief introduction to the content of his second speech that was recorded in verses 44 through 49, we come to chapter 5 and verse 1 and we read, Moses called all Israel and said unto them, Hear, O Israel, the statutes and judgments which I speak in your ears this day, that you may learn them and keep and do them. Chapter 5, verse 1. Now consider then, in verses 2 through 5, we have a principle called corporate identity. Now Moses reminded the people in verse 2 that they were bound to the Lord by a covenant, one that the previous generation, their fathers and perhaps their grandfathers, had affirmed in Horeb. Now Horeb being the same as Mount Sinai. Now lest anyone object and suppose that the covenant did not bind them, Moses stated the principle of corporate solidarity. And I read verse 3. The Lord made not this covenant with our fathers, but with us, even us who are, all of us here, alive this day. Now, even though some were not yet alive, the principle of corporate solidarity meant that the covenant that their father and their grandfathers would have made belonged also to their children and grandchildren. Why? Because it was a covenant identification with the nation. Now, how did the Lord then establish his covenant with Israel as a nation? In verse 4, we read, He talked with them face to face in the mount out of the midst of fire. So this is going all the way back to where Moses was given the commandments and the laws, all the way back in Exodus chapter 20. Now, Moses then, in verse 5, explained how he served as Israel's mediator and received the law and commandments from the Lord. Now, verses 6 through 22, we are given the precepts of the covenant. Now, notice then that God's covenant with Israel began in verse 6 with a preamble. I am the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. Now, after stating the preamble, Moses rehearsed the Decalogue. What is the Decalogue? It is 10 words or 10 statements. In this instance, it is the 10 commandments, verses 7 through verse 21. Now, these are also recorded in Exodus 20. Now, I'm not going to continue a study of those, not because they're not important, they're essential, but if you refer to my earlier video devotional on Exodus 20, you will see a thorough study of the commandments. Now, in verses 22 through 33, we ask where and how the 10 commandments were delivered. Well, we read that the Lord's Spirit descended upon Horeb, again, Mount Sinai, and the Lord spoke in verse 22 unto all the assembly in the mount of the midst of the fire, of the cloud, and of the thick darkness. He spoke with a great voice, and we read, he added no more. And then he wrote them in 2 tables of stone and delivered them unto me. Again, Moses referring to the 10 commandments. Now we read in verse 25 how the people were terrified at the sight for the mountain, that is Sinai, did burn with fire. The very presence of God was revealed as a burning fire. And we read in verse 26 that the voice of the Lord rumbled like thunder. Then, fearing the Lord, the people had entreated Moses. Now again, we're all the way back to Exodus chapter 20 and 38 years earlier. The people entreated Moses to serve as their mediator, saying, and I quote, Go thou near, and hear all that the Lord our God shall say. Speak unto us all that the Lord our God shall speak unto thee. and we will hear it and do it. Verse 27. And so therein was the covenant established. And so in verse 28 then, the Lord agreed to the people's request and commended them and said, Deuteronomy 5:28, this historical event recorded here, oh, that there were such a heart in them, that they would fear me, now this is the Lord speaking, and keep all my commandments always, that it might be well with them and with their children forever. What a wonderful aspiration. That the God of Israel, whose presence and voice terrified them, longed for his people to fear, literally to revere him and keep his commandments. The Lord, in verse 28 of chapter 5 of Deuteronomy, desired that it would be well with them and with their children forever. He promised that if Israel would keep his commandments, it would be well with them. Verse 33. Well, here's the closing thought for this, and it is, do you know the Lord wants to bless you and your loved ones? And yet, the blessings of the Lord are promised to those who, in the words of Moses, observe to do as the Lord your God hath commanded, and neither turn aside to the right hand or to the left. Verse 32. Sadly, some choose to take detours from the way and the path of righteousness, and they wonder why things go badly for them and their loved ones. In the words of Solomon, the way of transgressors is hard. My friend, are you following the path that brings you closer to the Lord and his promise of blessings? Well, thank you for being a part of this. Again, I'm catching up on these video devotionals, and I trust as I do so that they are a blessing to you. God bless, and bye-bye.